Have you ever saved someone's life? How did it happen? I told my father he has to go see a doctor or I would force him. He was super tired all the time. Turns out he had cancer and his liver was about to fail. I really hope this turned out well. Good on you to notice something amiss. Happy holidays, friend. I don't know if this really fits. I needed a kidney. My cousin volunteered. During their testing of her they found a small mass they thought was just fat. It turned out to be cancer. Most kidney cancer apparently is not caught until it's too late because your other kidney takes on the work and you don't get symptoms. She was able to get it all removed and is now cancer free. Didn't even need chemo, just surgery. Anyway, she claims I saved her life. I claim she saved her own by being willing to donate. She tried to save your life and you pulled a no reverse card on her. I had a good friend who was going through some very stressful times in his life. He began experiencing symptoms of severe anxiety, tension, headaches, feelings of dizziness, and lethargy. He went to the doctors, who prescribed him benzos. He wasn't doing good and I went over several times to his house and he seemed like he was losing it. I would call him periodically to check in from time to time to see how he was doing and try to calm him. One day I had felt like I had a need to call him right then and there. I called him and he answered crying. I asked how he was doing and he said not good. I went and picked him up. Noticed an empty fifth of whiskey on his dresser. He had always been a heavy drinker and at that moment I realized that benzos and alcohol don't mix. I took him to the ER and he was admitted. He has a BAC of 0.36, indicating he was an alcoholic or he would be dead. From there we convinced him to take his SSRIs and go to rehab. On my way to drop him off at rehab he told me, "Hey man, you're a great friend. I just want you to know that if you hadn't showed up today, I was going to kill myself." That hit me hard. Whoa, just wow. When I was probably about 12 or 13 I saved my 4-year brother's life. We were in Oregon for spring break as a family and were watching the ocean waves on the beach. Suddenly an enormous rogue wave came out of nowhere and it pushed us all the way up the beach and against the cliffs. As the water rushed out I saw my brother tumbling in the surge, so I lunged and grabbed him with one arm and held on for dear life to a big rock with the other. My shoes, jacket and wallet along with other family members' belongings were all swept out to sea, but I still have a brother. Sneaker waves are no joke. One day in college, I was on my way to grab dinner with some friends and ran into another friend in the parking lot. I invited him to come with me and join us, and we proceeded to have a totally unremarkable dinner in the cafe. Years later, post-graduation, we were hanging out one night getting a bit drunk and stoned and he confessed to me that he was on his way to kill himself that night when I ran into him. My oh my, good for him that you crossed his path. We just never know how we can make an impact on someone else's life. Scuba. The zip tie that holds the mouthpiece onto the regulator broke and when the diver exhaled, the regulator popped out of the rubber mouthpiece and fell off to the side. The diver didn't notice until they exhaled all their air and then tried to inhale. They freaked and tried to bolt for the surface from about 120 feet. I grabbed them with one hand and tried to shove my spare regulator into their mouth, but they wouldn't spit out the useless rubber mouthpiece. A fellow dive instructor grabbed me and anchored himself to the mooring line, so we stopped ascending. I free-flowed my spare regulator into the diver's rubber mouthpiece and that got him to snap out of it and register what I was trying to do. He spit his mouthpiece out, stuffed my regulator into his mouth, took a big breath, and tried to bolt for the surface again. I stayed clamped to him and my partner stayed clamped to me in the mooring line. Eventually the guy calmed down and got himself back under control, after which we made a controlled descent. Well done. I had a regulator freeze closed on me at about 90 feet when I was on my third dive. My very experienced instructor probably saved my life then. Was in the middle of a neighborhood pool and watched a toddler at the side of the pool, 10 ft end, take his floats off and then jump in the water. He curled up like a ball and began to sink quickly. I was able to reach him before he reached the bottom. He was scared but screaming. The babysitter was on her phone. Kind of similar story, but I was the lifeguard. The requirements for swimming in the deep end were a joke and I watched one kid who couldn't swim to save his life, literally hanging on the edge in the deepest part. I walked over cause he looked tired and sure enough he lost his grip and slipped right under. I dropped to my knees and pulled him up. He stopped going into the deep end after that. I am a doctor. Even then I can count the number of times I can say I've saved someone's life on one hand with fingers left over. I was working at an athletics event. After a long distance running event that was open entry, a person collapsed and stopped breathing. I worked with my team to stabilize them and transfer them to hospital. They needed support for their airway to keep breathing. Had they not had it, they would have asphyxiated and died. I met them with their spouse and 8-year-old child a few months later. Actually on this day a few years ago. That was the biggest reward for me. The best feeling. I'd reply that doctors save lives every day with their diagnosis and the healing, before ailments escalate to something more serious. I heard a faint domestic fire alarm one night that wouldn't quit, so I walked down the street to identify where the alarm was coming from. I knocked on the door but there no answer. I couldn't smell smoke or feel heat off the door but decided to call the fire brigade just in case. They arrived pretty quickly and I pointed out which unit the alarm was coming from. They walked up to the door, then ran back to the truck to grab a door banging opening thingo and the hose reels. Next thing, all this smoke is pouring out the front door and they're carrying an old lady down the stairs. Then another fiery emerged carrying the lady's cat. Turns out she had turned on the stove to cook dinner but fell asleep. The unit was filled with smoke and she would have asphyxiated, but both she and the kitty survived. She wrote me a lovely note thanking me, which was nice. Moral of the story is to pay attention to noises, things that are out of place. It's better to be safe than sorry, and look after each other. I appreciate the fact that you told us about the kitty, men wouldn't. Had an employee come into my office complaining of pain. Started inquiring about the specifics and took a bit for him to start saying his arm was hurting and tingling. Said his chest didn't feel right. Load him up in my car and we go to a clinic as he thought he pulled a muscle working. Clinic doc said he had indigestion and to go home. When we got back into the car I looked at him and made the decision to go to the ER just in case. He was triaged and in surgery 30 minutes later and had a stent installed. Don't remember the exact percentage of blockage but it was pretty bad. If he had gone home probably wouldn't have survived. It's a long, detailed story but I'll keep it short. My brother came home from work and went to use the bathroom. When he came back, he asked if I wanted to join him for a cigarette on the back porch. I said sure and went to get my shoes while he went out back. When I went to join him, he was laying in the backyard, pale, sweaty and barely conscious. I had to carry him inside, which was no easy featuring since he's taller and heavier. I put him on the floor in the kitchen and he just circled a drain in front of me. I'm an EMT and I couldn't figure out what was happening. He went into cardiac arrest and died in front of me. I did CPR while the ambulance came and got a pulse right as they entered the house. It turned out he had some bad coke that had some opiate mixed in. Even though it was a happy ending, it really fricked me up. It's been over a year now and I think about it every day. I can recall every detail like it happened yesterday. I've never been the same since it happened. I feel as though a part of me died in exchange for my brother's life. A few friends and I saved a tourist family from drowning while surfing on the island of Oahu. We had been surfing an outer reef on the south shore that was a good half mile or so off the coast when we noticed a family paddling out on a kayak. A single person kayak with a dad, younger daughter maybe 8 and a son maybe 12 on the nose and tail, and with an older teenage son paddling behind on a boogie board. They paddled directly into an area of the reef where 4/5 featuring waves were crashing very fast and very powerfully onto pretty much dry reef. It took only seconds for us to see them go from paddling along in the kayak to seeing them all bobbing in the waves and the kayak 200 yards away, stuck on the reef. We quickly paddled across the channel as fast as we could. We then each gave one of the kids and the dad outboards and pulled them by our leashes far enough into the lagoon and they could walk. About 100 yards or so. I vividly remember the dad saying, "I'm not panicking. I'm not panicking," over and over in a thick Russian accent and having to reassure him that he'd be okay but needs to focus on what we were doing. Just goes to show how dangerous the ocean is and how deadly it could have been for that family if we weren't there. This gave me so much anxiety reading it. Good for you for noticing and thinking, acting so quickly. People act so dumb in the ocean sometimes. It can be calming, beautiful and peaceful, but it can turn so quickly and be unforgiving. Yes, well, not single-handedly, but with the help of my mother and my older brother, we found him hanging from the rafters, cut him down, performed chest compressions for 30 minutes, until the paramedics arrived. Kid was drowning. Lifeguard yelled at me. I jumped in the pool and grabbed him. I was the closest adult. Happened in 7 seconds. I got free pool passes. Thanks for being a good human. I rescued my uncle from a riptide when I was about 12. He was a big guy and I was obviously much smaller, but I was a strong swimmer and more importantly knew that you swim parallel to the beach, out of the riptide, and then back in. He kept trying to swim directly back to shore and eventually became exhausted and yelled for help. I was lucky that he didn't force me down when I reached him, which is a very common and non-intentional aspect of rescuing people from drowning. They almost don't know they are doing it, but he mustered enough strength to basically let me tow his floating body without thrashing or latching on. I swam laterally and then back into shore. When I was in middle school, my dad took me to one of his friend's barbecues. His friend had a young son that I think was 4 or 5 at the time. Everyone had been swimming in the pool and went in the yard to go eat. No one saw the little kid run back to the pool except for me. Before I could say anything, he jumped in without his swimmies. I ran as fast as I could to him as he thrashed in the water, and I pulled him out. His parents were absolutely shocked and terrified. They didn't think he would do anything like that. Thankfully he ended up being fine, and it scared him out of doing it again. Always watch your kids if you have a pool. Even if you think they know better, they probably don't. Even if you think they know better, they probably don't. Kids do so many things despite knowing better. Sometimes the part of the brain that knows stuff somehow isn't involved in quick actions. I'm a peds nurse and I got a post-op patient. She was 9 years old and was having a second revision surgery to her cleft palate repair. A year prior, a different end had tried to take tissue from her throat and add it to her palate to prevent as much airflow as possible. This was considered cosmetic because the airflow was causing the patient to have a high mini-mouse voice. That surgery did not work as the graft failed. No other end would try it again. But a new end moved to town and agreed to try. She was stable when they brought her to my floor, obviously in pain, drooling, but stable. She used a board to write and told her dad she was hungry. I had not even finished checking her into the computer, 10 minutes, when I heard what I assumed was phlegm in her throat. This can be common after surgery because of intubation, especially when your throat has just been operated on. Her dad and I encouraged her to gently cough and spit out the mucus, as it was getting harder for her to breathe. She gently coughed, gave me an absolute look of panic, passed out, and a pool of blood came out of her mouth so quickly, it made a continuous stream of blood onto the floor. I called a code, immediately repositioned her, and suctioned her throat so she could breathe. The suction canister began to fill with blood and I knew she was dying. I called another code for blood bank so they could send me 6 units stat. At this point the blood was copious and after she stopped breathing, I began to bag her, manually ventilate, and her blood sprayed everywhere in a fine mist. That night I washed my face and found tiny blood droplets stuck to my eyelashes. It was on the ceiling of her room. Trying to ventilate a hemorrhaging surgical site is not something anyone is prepared for. My team and I worked to stabilize her, provided CPR for 20 minutes and transfused her all the way down to where her surgeon had rushed to meet us. He cauterized the bleeders and at the debriefing admitted she had bled a lot in the oar and had used 3x the normal amount of lidocaine to get it to finally stop. Those lidocaine doses all wore off right when I got her on the floor, so it was no surprise she bled. Our hospital changed its policy to only allow palate repairs or any oral airway post-op risk surgery patients to remain in PICU overnight with an oral airway at bedside in case of code. My patient survived, took a big neuro hit, but finally could qualify for rehab. Went for months and now can ride a bike, ski and is almost caught up in school. I thank God every day I was in her room when it happened or she wouldn't be here. During the mayhem, her mother fainted in the corner of the room and her dad stood across her bed, screaming in my face she's dying. Do something over and over. I could feel his breath blowing my hair back, but my vision had narrowed and I blocked him out in order to focus on what I needed to quickly do for my patient. Very stressful. Whoa, that is so impressive. I'm glad you could stay calm and let your training kick in. You're a hero. I was in a Discord for people suffering from PTSD. I've saved a couple people from suicide by listening to them and telling them to sleep on it, because death is a big decision. Sleeping also helps reset your emotional regulators and they felt much better once they woke up. I've saved myself with this trick a few times, too. Saving yourself is still saving a life. Glad you've figured out coping methods bad such that work for you. A car was on the road in front of me one night, and driving pretty quickly. We were both going over 100 mph, and then I thought they were switching lanes, but they kept going, right into the guardrail and the engine flew from the car. The battery ended up somewhere in the woods. The first responders found it while surveying the damage, and they were lucky I was there. The dude fell asleep at the wheel and his wife was in the passenger seat and their 16-year-old son was in the back. This was at maybe 3 AM on a deserted stretch of highway in Virginia. He broke his leg and was bleeding pretty badly from his face and the bone poking through his calf. Luckily, his brain wasn't mush and he was aware enough to converse with. His wife's airbag didn't go off but somehow only banged her head. And I thought she died but thankfully she was only unconscious for a few moments and then she started to slur her speech and say what I think was what's going on. I never checked her pulse because I was focused on the driver. The son was in the better condition between the three of them. He was asleep in the back of the car and was perfectly fine. All their phones had disappeared. I'm sure they were all thrown from the car. I never found them. Had I not been there to witness it, and had I not stopped, dude would have bled out. The wife was in no condition to talk to anybody, and the son that was pretty much unscathed wouldn't have had a way to contact anybody to get help. It was so deserted where we were at that it took the ambulance and cops over 20 minutes to find us. I used my belt as a tourniquet on the dude's thigh, and the EMTs in the ambulance told me I did a good job doing this. I'm glad they taught us and I paid attention to some emergency first aid training in Navy boot camp. Although I wish I had my Navy issued belt because I would have been able to do a better job of it. I still think about this every Thanksgiving, as it happened on the Sunday night after Thanksgiving back in 2011. I hope they are doing well. Dang, that family was really lucky to have you. You're a hero, dude. We get a call for an attempted suicide. Dude slit his wrist bad. When we got to him he was ghost white, like a sheet of paper white. Put pressure on the wound, kept him conscious until medics arrived. He survived, thanked us once he recovered. Great work. I hope that person is in a better state now. Was eating dinner with my kid. I think she was maybe 4 at the time. She started choking. I quickly shot my hand into her abdomen up and in mimicking a Heimlich. Whatever it was she was eating came flying out of her mouth. Once she was good the stress got me, and I went and cried in the bathroom for a couple minutes. Nothing as bad as scared parent tears due to almost misses with your kids. Friend overdosed on HR administered CPR before the paramedics arrived. They did not have to administer Narcan when they arrived as she was breathing when they arrived. Thank you bud. I hope she's in a better state of mind and healthy now. The junk is a goddamn demon. There's a pool in the basement of my building. On the way to my apartment from the parkade, I have to pass it. One day I was just making the trek, not really paying attention to my surroundings when a guy yells, "I think she's drowning." I looked in and my first thought was that she looked like she was doing a breathing exercise, but I decided not to gamble on it. I don't remember much of the next 15 seconds, but I've pieced together that after he said that, I sprinted to the door, scanned my fob and ran in. I took off towards the deep of the pool and decided to leave my shoes on and phone in pocket. I threw off my backpack and sunglasses and jumped in. I touched her and she immediately climbed me. I knew right then that she was drowning. If you touch a conscious person face down in a pool, they'll look up at you, think for a second, and react. She did not look. She did not think. She climbed. I had recently read on Reddit that the reflex to climb anything you possibly can is a thing drowning people have. Fortunately, the pool was only up to my neck or I'd have gone down. I pulled her to the edge and got her to grab a hold of it. She was breathing. I pulled myself up to take a seat on the edge of the pool and, among my deepest shames, I pulled out my phone to turn it off to minimize water damage. After I put it back in my pocket, the guy who was there and I pulled her out the rest of the way. I told them to get her to contact a hospital about the possibility of dry drowning. I picked up my stuff and went to my apartment. I got in the shower after the pool and then cried and cried and cried. This lasted about an hour. It was one of the scariest moments of my life despite the fact that I was never in harm's way. I would do it again in an instant. Never beat yourself up over taking the moment to turn your phone off there. You were acting on instinct and adrenaline for the entire rescue. You wouldn't have been thinking entirely clearly in that moment, even if it felt like you were. You saved that woman's life. You are a hero and there is absolutely nothing here to be ashamed of. My dad and I were on vacation in Paris a couple years ago, walking by the river. There weren't that many people around. Jet lag. We were up early, and this girl jogged by us with her dog off leash. A couple of ducks saw the dog coming about 30 feet ahead of us and went into the water. Dog goes in after ducks. Girl goes in after dog. Because it was the Seine in the middle of Paris and the banks are all paved and, apparently, steep. Neither of them could get up on their own right. We pulled them both out, one after the other, and then this husky the size of a dire wolf had the nerve to shake off all over us. Probably they would have figured it out if we hadn't been there, or someone else would have heard the yelling in time to help them. Still, it's a fun story. Leash your dogs, kids. Leash your dogs, kids. Train them not to jump into water. A friend's dog once pulled me into a lake. I don't know if it counts, but last week my friend attempted suicide while he was on the phone to me, and I called his parents before he could do enough to go, who took him to the hospital. I know what would have happened if I hadn't picked up the call and it frightens me so much that I won't be there next time. I'm an old fart and you sound young. I am so glad you helped your friend, but please know it is not your responsibility to help others at the expense of yourself. Being a loving human is awesome, but take time to love yourself too. I'm so sappy and old. Kind of. I was getting hay off a friend of the family. He was up in the loft throwing bales down and I was carrying them to my truck. I came back into the barn and he was laying on the ground. Now he was a silly old man, so I thought he just lay down because his hands were placed neatly over his chest. It also sounded like he was making fake snoring sounds. I just walked by and was like taking a nap and grabbed another bale of hay and took it to the truck. I came back to get another bale and thought it was weird he was still on the ground. I noticed there was blood coming from his head. He had fallen off the loft and hit his head off some farm equipment and what I thought were fake place snores was his body trying to catch his breath from having the wind knocked out of him. I called 911. An ambulance came, and he had to be flown to a hospital out of the area. He ended up having some brain bleeding, but that was 5 years ago and he's doing fine now. He was already in the loft when I got there, so if I decided to just not get hay that day and he still fell, there's no telling how long he would have laid there. His wife still tells people to this day about how I finished loading the hay before calling 911. Technically, she's not wrong. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.